Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, is often remembered as one of history's most fearsome rulers. His name alone evokes an era of bloodshed, betrayal, and psychological torment that Russia has yet to fully shake. But what was the most terrible thing Ivan the Terrible did? This question has puzzled historians for centuries, as Ivan's reign was marked by countless brutalities, massacres, assassinations, and a systematic reign of terror that few could survive unscathed. While Ivan's actions terrorized his subjects, one event in particular stands out, a moment so harrowing that it's often cited as the single act that cemented his legacy as a ruler beyond redemption. From his darkest tactics of torture and public executions to the horrors unleashed on his own family, we'll uncover what drove Ivan to commit this final, devastating act. Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, stands as one of history's most infamous figures, a ruler whose very name stirs memories of cruelty and paranoia that scarred Russia for centuries. But before he became the terrifying figure of legend, he was a vulnerable child, thrust into a life of tragedy, betrayal, and relentless abuse. Understanding Ivan's early life is essential to grasping the darkness that eventually consumed him and the horrifying acts he'd go on to commit. Born in 1530 as the son of Grand Prince Vasily III, Ivan was just a toddler when his father's death left him in the vulnerable position of a child ruler. At 3 years old, Ivan was crowned with a title of authority, but his reality was one of helplessness. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, ruled as regent, but she too faced resistance from the boyar families, Russia's noble class, who sought to seize power for themselves. Power in medieval Russia was a vicious game, and Ivan, a mere child, became an unprotected pawn on a treacherous board. When he was only 8, tragedy struck again. His mother died under suspicious circumstances, widely believed to have been poisoned by those in her inner circle. Ivan was now an orphaned figurehead, surrounded by noble families who saw him as a puppet rather than a person. These years were filled with intense isolation and suffering. Some accounts describe young Ivan and his brother living in squalid quarters, neglected and at times even subjected to physical abuse by nobles who flaunted their power with casual cruelty. They endured hunger, filth, and a total lack of care, all in the shadows of Russia's opulent court. This harrowing childhood left Ivan deeply scarred. With no one to protect him, he learned that power in Russia came not from titles, but from ruthlessness. By adolescence, Ivan had cultivated a seething hatred for the boyars and a profound distrust for anyone who held authority. These feelings would fester, shaping him into a ruler determined to wield absolute control. Mercy in Ivan's mind was nothing more than weakness, a vulnerability he could no longer afford. So, when Ivan finally took the reins of power at age 16, he was ready to prove his strength and solidify his rule. His first actions as Tsar seemed to promise a fairer, stronger Russia. He introduced reforms that established a new code of laws, strengthened the military, and convened the first Russian parliament, setting the stage for a more unified state. But this brief phase of reform and progress soon gave way to something far darker. In 1560, tragedy struck Ivan yet again. His beloved wife, Anastasia, died unexpectedly, and Ivan was convinced that she too had been poisoned by traitors in his court. Her death was a breaking point for him, triggering a downward spiral into paranoia and fury. He grew obsessed with the notion that enemies lurked everywhere, hiding in plain sight. This fear led him to create the Oprichnina, a feared militia loyal only to him, charged with rooting out treachery wherever it appeared. The Oprichniki, as they were known, answered Ivan's fears with brutal efficiency, unleashing terror across the Russian populace. Torture, executions, and public punishments became common, instilling fear in anyone who might consider disloyalty. Ivan's rule, once marked by hopeful reform, was now defined by paranoia and bloodshed. Those early years of torment and betrayal had left him haunted by a single lesson: trust no one. Even family, as he would later prove, could become a target of his wrath. With the creation of the Oprichnina, Ivan's reign took on a sinister new character, one that would cement his reputation as a ruler driven by paranoia and brutality. The Oprichniki, his specially chosen guard, operated as an extension of Ivan's own wrath. Dressed in black and mounted on black horses, they moved through the land like an ominous shadow, spreading terror wherever they went. They carried symbols of their duty, a dog's head symbolizing their scent for traitors, and a broom to sweep them away. For the people of Russia, the sight of an Oprichnik was often the last thing they would see. The Oprichniki's brutal tactics spared no one. In their mission to eliminate Ivan's perceived enemies, they employed unimaginable methods of torture: burning, mutilation, and impalement. Public executions became a form of twisted entertainment. On some occasions, Ivan himself attended these gruesome spectacles in Moscow's Red Square, where traitors were dismembered, burned alive, or skinned. The message was clear: dissent, real or imagined, would be met with the most horrific punishments. No one was safe, not even the country's powerful noble families. Ivan's mistrust extended to the boyars, Russia's ruling class, many of whom he accused of plotting against him. Entire families were annihilated on suspicion alone, often leaving no survivors to carry on their lineage. Some of the most prominent noble families were stripped of their land and wealth, brutally tortured, and executed. Many were forced to watch their loved ones die before facing the same fate. Through these relentless purges, Ivan weakened the nobility to the point where none dared to oppose him openly. His rule was absolute, but it came at a severe cost to Russia's social fabric. Even the Russian Orthodox Church, traditionally a powerful institution in Russian life, was not immune to Ivan's wrath. His paranoia extended to religious figures, leading him to target high-ranking members of the clergy. He forced priests and bishops to endorse his absolute power, and those who refused faced torture, exile, or death. Some were accused of harboring conspiracies against the throne, often on the flimsiest of evidence, and suffered the brutal consequences. The clergy, once a guiding moral force, became yet another instrument for Ivan's oppressive regime, and those who resisted paid with their lives. One of the darkest chapters of Ivan's Oprichnina rule was the Massacre of Novgorod. Rumors reached Ivan that the prosperous city of Novgorod was conspiring to defect to Lithuania, a treasonous act in his eyes. Although the rumors were likely unfounded, Ivan saw this as an existential threat. In response, he unleashed the Oprichniki, who attacked with a brutality seldom seen in Russian history. The city was laid to waste. Men, women, and children were dragged from their homes, tortured, and slaughtered. Entire families were executed, their bodies left unburied as a stark warning. Historians estimate that tens of thousands perished, and the psychological scars ran deep. For Ivan, the massacre was a lesson in loyalty, but for the Russian people, it was a nightmare that showed the extent of his unrestrained violence. Yet, Ivan's cruelty didn't stop at the high-profile executions and massacres. He systematically devastated the lands of those he suspected of disloyalty, using a scorched earth policy on his own kingdom. Villages, farmlands, and entire regions were set ablaze, their crops destroyed, leading to famine and starvation. Innocent villagers, peasants who had nothing to do with the supposed conspiracies, found themselves displaced, their homes and livelihoods obliterated as collateral in Ivan's quest for control. This devastation created a fractured, fearful society, with starvation and suffering spreading across the land. By now, Ivan was ruling through sheer terror. The constant bloodshed and suffering reflected the deep-seated paranoia that had festered within him since childhood. Each act of cruelty, each public execution and village razed, was justified in his mind as necessary for his survival and the stability of his rule. The truth, however, was that his actions were shattering the country, fostering an environment of fear and distrust where loyalty was born of terror, not respect. As Ivan's mental state continued to deteriorate, his violent outbursts became increasingly frequent and irrational. Each slight, real or imagined, could ignite his fury, leading to executions, torture, or destruction. The instability of his rule reached its peak, paving the way for the most terrible act of his reign, a tragedy so personal and devastating that it would haunt him until his final days. Ivan's life of paranoia and brutality reached a tragic climax in one infamous moment, a moment that forever scarred his legacy and even shocked the merciless ruler himself. This tragedy involved his eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, who was both his heir and perhaps his last chance to leave behind a stable future for Russia. The relationship between father and son had always been strained, filled with tension and fierce expectations. Even the Terrible raised his son to be strong, disciplined, and unwavering. Yet the young Ivan had grown increasingly independent, a trait his father viewed with suspicion. In 1581, tensions within the royal family came to a head. Accounts vary, but most sources agree that the event began with a dispute over Ivan Ivanovich's wife, who was pregnant at the time. Ivan the Terrible, disapproving of her attire and viewing it as an affront to his standards, reportedly beat her so severely that she suffered a miscarriage. When the young Ivan confronted his father about this brutal treatment of his wife, a heated argument erupted. The son's anger and indignation were matched by his father's fury. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Ivan the Terrible struck his son on the head with his scepter, dealing a fatal blow. Witnesses reported that the younger Ivan fell to the ground, blood pooling around him. As the realization of what he had done washed over him, the father was overcome with horror. He cradled his dying son in his arms, weeping and begging for forgiveness. But it was too late. Ivan Ivanovich, his pride and heir, died from his injuries, and with him died Ivan the Terrible's hope for a stable dynasty. The aftermath of this event shattered Ivan. For a ruler who had ordered the deaths of thousands without a second thought, the murder of his own son was a torment beyond any punishment he had inflicted on others. Historical accounts describe a broken man, wandering the Kremlin's halls, overcome with guilt and sorrow. He was haunted by his own actions, his once ironclad resolve unraveling under the weight of his sins. This single act of filicide left Russia without a capable successor. Ivan's only remaining heir, Fyodor, was weak and ill-suited to rule, setting Russia on a course toward instability. The vacuum left by Ivan Ivanovich's death plunged Russia into a period known as the Time of Troubles. With foreign invasions, famine, and civil unrest, Russia spiraled into chaos, a dark chapter that many saw as Ivan's true legacy. In his pursuit of control, he had instead left his country vulnerable to collapse. As he aged, Ivan's cruelty lost its intensity. It was as if the murder of his son had sapped him of his once fearsome energy. In his final years, he continued to rule, but he did so as a shell of his former self. Haunted by the memory of his son's death, he reportedly spent nights plagued by nightmares, muttering to himself, perhaps seeking some semblance of peace that would never come. Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, leaving behind a kingdom traumatized by years of violence and fear, a legacy of instability and the memory of a single, unforgivable act that had condemned his family and perhaps Russia itself to years of suffering. And to this day, when people think of Ivan the Terrible, they remember not just his countless cruelties, but the moment that defined him. A father's murder of his own son. A final act of terror that cemented his place as one of history's most terrifying rulers.